Welcome back to the Lights Out podcast. Bedtime stories for boys and girls, for when the lights go out. Good evening, boys and girls. Are you all tucked up and ready for another Lights Out bedtime story? Well, you are in for an amazing treat tonight because we have another book by the one and only Roald Dahl. And this time the book is called The Twits. That's right, The Twits. And I'm not even going to count how many chapters are in this book. There are loads. So we'll start at chapter 1. Hairy Faces. What a lot of hairy-faced men there are around nowadays. When a man grows hair all over his face, it's impossible to tell what he really looks like. Perhaps that's why he does it. He'd rather you didn't know. Then, there's the problem of washing. When the very hairy ones wash their faces, it must be as big a job as when you and I wash the hair on our heads. So what I want to know is, how often do all these hairy-faced men wash their faces? Is it only once a week, like us, on a Sunday night? And do they shampoo it? Do they use a hairdryer? Do they rub hair tonic in to stop their faces from going bald? Do they go to the barber to have their hairy faces cut and trimmed? Or do they do it themselves in front of the bathroom mirror with nail scissors? I don't know, but next time you see a man with a hairy face, which will probably be as soon as you step out onto the street, maybe you will look at him more closely and start to wonder about some of these things. Chapter 2 in The Twits by Roald Dahl. Mr. Twit. Mr. Twit was one of these very hairy-faced men. The whole of his face, except for his forehead, his eyes and his nose, was covered with thick hair. The stuff even sprouted in revolting tufts out of his nostrils and ear holes. Mr. Twit felt that this hairiness made him look terrifically wise and grand. But in truth, he was neither of these things. Mr. Twit was a twit. He was born a twit. And now, at the age of 60, he was a bigger twit than ever. The hair on Mr. Twit's face didn't grow smooth and matted as it does on most hairy-faced men. It grew in spikes and stuck out straight, like the bristles on a nail brush. And how often did Mr. Twit wash this bristly nail-brushy face of his? The answer is never. Not even on a Sunday. He hadn't washed it for years. The end. Chapter 3 in The Twits by Roald Dahl. As you know, an ordinary unhairy face like yours or mine simply gets a bit smudgy if it's not washed often enough. And there's nothing so awful about that. But a hairy face is a very different matter. Things cling to hairs, especially food. Things like gravy go right in among the hairs and stay there. You and I can wipe our smooth faces with a flannel and we quickly look more or less all right again. But the hairy man cannot do that. We can also, if we are careful, eat our meals without spreading food all over our faces. But not so the hairy man. Watch carefully next time you see a hairy man eating his lunch, and you will notice that even if he opens his mouth very wide, it is impossible for him to get a spoonful of beef stew or ice cream and chocolate sauce into it without leaving some of it on his hairs. Mr. Twit didn't even bother to open his mouth wide when he ate. As a result, and because he never washed, there were always hundreds of bits of old breakfasts and lunches and suppers sticking out. Sticking to the hairs around his face. They weren't big bits, mind you, because he used to wipe those off with the back of his hand or the sleeve while he was eating. But if you look closely, not that you'd ever want to, you would see tiny little specks of dried up scrambled eggs stuck to the hairs, and spinach and tomato ketchup and fish fingers and minced chicken livers and all the other disgusting things Mr. Twit liked to eat. If you look closer still, hold your noses, ladies and gentlemen. If you peer deep into the moustachy bristles sticking out over his upper lip, you would probably see much larger objects than had escaped the wipe of his hand, things that had been there for months and months, like a piece of maggoty green cheese, or a mouldy old cornflake, or even the slimy tail of a tin sardine. Because of all this, Mr. Twit never went really hungry. By sticking out his tongue and curling it sideways to explore the hairy jungle around his mouth, he was always able to find a tasty morsel here and there to nibble on. What I'm trying to tell you is that Mr. Twit was a foul and smelly old man. He was also an extremely horrid old man, as you will find out in a moment. That's the end of Chapter 3 of The Twits by Roald Dahl, the one and only Roald Dahl, here on the Lights Out Podcast, bedtime stories for boys and girls. Good night.